Yeah, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, um, to the second lecture of Fundamentals of Electrical Stimulation. I try to place that stuff somewhere where it doesn't hurt too much. And I like to share some information, thoughts, and backgrounds on nerve excitation with you. So, the Ilias system is not yet up and running. I had some other burning bushfires to extinguish somewhere, and I'll promise to do that by the end of this week. So I think the first lecture was not that difficult, and today I kindly ask you just to listen and make your notes somehow, somewhere. If you need that, and then I'll load up the slides, hopefully a day before the lecture for the following slides, and you get the recordings afterwards. The new Camtasia system is still challenging me, since the export function takes about an hour, so we always have to try to do that somewhere overnight, or to get the recordings here and do it somewhere else. So that is an update that is not my favorite one of that system so far. What is the topic or the outline for today? I like to dive with you into the description of nerve excitation. So we have a nerve cell, and a nerve cell is a nerve cell because it has an electrical potential and is able to generate an active thing, the action potential. And I like to go with you through those mechanisms, not purely from the biological side, but also from the side of electrical fields and current flows and diffusion equations that you might have already had in different contexts. So I just got an email from a colleague of mine who asked me, my students tell me they have never heard that the negative gradient of the electrical field is a potential. That must be a very, very short-term memory in his students then, since I looked that up because I was really suspicious. Did I forget that to teach in electrical stimulation? No, it was in there. It was just a spotlight here. So, and I'll like to remind you then where you might have seen those equations before, that you get a better idea how to use them or how to use them in this context here. And at the very end, this goes a little bit back and forth here from biology to engineering and biology. At the end of today, we end up with some equivalent circuit models that could help us then later on in electrical stimulation to couple somehow the current or the voltage that comes from a technical device into a model of the nervous system to get an idea how to do that. And I decided this year to skip that modeling lecture for several reasons. So one reason is that I had to squeeze some other things together, but that's my thing. The other reason is that I believe that the modeling, as I have had it before, is not really helping you to understand that. And I know that others, like Stefan Rotter, for example, from the Bernstein Center and the biology, is really good in doing that modeling stuff. So if it happens to you that you get excited about modeling stuff, there are other persons that are much more educated than I am to teach you that aspect. And I decided it's probably better to get you more interested in recent research on sensory feedback and electrical stimulation and mechanical stimulation and how this is currently seen at the end to apply all those aspects from the other lectures here. Good. This is here, let's say, all the slides just in one without those terms. And we start again from the nerve cell that you might know. So we have incoming structures, the dendrites, we have the soma as a kind of processing structure, and the axon to guide whatever comes to the output terminals and to connect it to another nerve cell. Cells can be very small. Some of the alpha motor neurons are the large ones in humans. That means they have 30, 40 microns soma diameter size. If you browse some textbooks from animal research, you will stumble over that giant squid cell. That was the one where a lot of basic investigations have been done. There are other nice creatures on Earth who have huge nerve cells that are very robust. Forgot the name of those creatures. They have been said 30 years ago on electronic transistors, and a lot of funny and fancy experiments have been done there. I don't want to go into those directions. I want to keep it more on the mammal level and give you hints if whatever a frog or a worm has different properties. My favorite, not my favorite model, but the model where I had to smile most was an earthworm, and some of my colleagues in France, they just put it and laid it on electrodes. Say, look, if we just take 2 pins, we can really fix him on the table, and then it's perfectly aligned with the electrode, and we can do something. Come on, that's probably not the best model to get something out that is really meaningful, you know. And this is something you have to find out in a later stage of your career if you browse through reports, if you discuss with others. Always make your mind, is this really a meaningful assembly of things? Does it help to answer my questions that I have? If it's really a model that helps to convince others that something is working or safe or whatever you like to see. And this is what you will learn a little bit here when it comes to certain aspects. Now we also discuss those models. Typical nerve cells, well, one can say the typical property of nerve cells is that they all look different. Yeah, so there is of course a sketch of the mother nerve cell as such, where we learn the terminology, but in real life, each and every nerve cell is a bit different depending where they are. We have those on the right-hand side, Purkinje cells in the cerebellum, with those mossy fibers having tens of thousands of connections to other cells to get really good integration over space and time. And then we have probably other cells that are really straightforward from one spot to another spot, like the alpha motor neurons from the motor cortex over the spinal cord, really, let's say, down to the place where they really innovate something. All in common is that cells have a cell membrane. That's not a surprise, but it's important to speak that out. It's a cell membrane, and this cell membrane builds the outer wall. And we can say what's inside is the intracellular space, and what's outside is the extracellular space. That's all not rocket science, and you all know that. I just wanted to repeat that a little bit, that we come to those points where the more exciting things are. We have elements passing through the cell membrane that could be ion channels. could be proteins that have some binding things outside and some binding spots inside, and then they mediate whatever processes. Those ion channels, as we'll see on one of the following slides, are selective to ions, to certain ions. If not, they would not be called ion channel. Yeah, if you have something that just leads something into the cell or something out of the cell, that's not an ion channel, that's a pore. A pore is more from the terminology unspecific. And if we make a mechanistic picture as shown here, we can measure an electrical potential from the inside of a cell to the outside of a cell. And then we have a sign, so plus or minus, and we have an amplitude in volt. That's the potential. And this depends on the type of ions we have around and on the amount of ions that we have around. And I don't want to talk too much on that slide here. There's just one thing that is a specialty in that environment, and that is the A minus. That means we have large N ions, and we don't want to name them. So large means they are larger than sodium or potassium, and if you have a larger entity, a longer molecule, it's probably too large to go through those tiny little holes that we have in there, and therefore they stay inside the cell. Another thing I learned, and I don't find the video clip, that was a more private one from one of my colleagues, it is that such a cell membrane is not like a piece of wood where you would drill some holes in there and you would say this hole is now an ion channel or a pore. It's more like a lake with sea lilies, where you have the leaves that cover the surface, but all in all, those sea lily leaves are able to float a little bit. And this seems to be similar with a cell membrane. That means those ion channels are not really very fixed in space. So normally they stay there, but there are options sometimes if you play around with nerve cells that those ion channels tend to move a little bit. I've seen a video ages ago, very impressive one for me, that shows if you stimulate certain cells in the brain too much, the ion channels go away from the site where you stimulate. You know, if you need them to get your cell excited and those ion channels decide, oh, I want to live somewhere else, then your whole transfer function of excitation changes. And therefore we start with the assumption they are there, we can rely on them, but if it goes into really complex, detailed process analysis, we should probably have a look on them if they're really still there where we expect them to be. So here's terminology. So if we have a non-specific hole in a channel, we call it a pore. If it's specific, we call it a channel. If diffusion takes place, then we have a passive transport. Means passive means in this context we do not need energy. The environment that we have is the reason that particles want to go from one place to another place. And as we'll see in some equations later on, diffusion means we have a number of particles in one spot and another number in another spot, and we assume, and this is the important assumption, diffusion and all the equations that we have of diffusion have the assumption that the particles are not charged. That means it's just the number, the concentration. If you have 10 particles here and 1 particle there, and you wait for a long time, having nothing in between, you would have 5.5 particles on each side. That means 5 here, 5 there, and the other one is going back and forth. And that does not mean that the single particle is always in a single spot, but you have a kind of thermodynamic equilibrium at the very end, where on average, the average number over time is the same. And then if you look in very detail, you would see that due to Brownian motion, for example, particles will go somewhere here, somewhere there, they will move a little bit. That means if we have charged particles, we have to take 2 pairs of glasses. So 1 pair of glasses looking on diffusion, how many do we have? And then in the second step, and that will come on another slide, we have to look if they are charged, what does that do with the electrical field? If I have 5 times plus here and 5 times minus on the other side, I have a beautiful electrical field. If I take some of those charges to the other side, the strength of the electrical field and the potential in between will change. But then you would say, then I count numbers again. And this is the really nasty thing in the background. We have an electrochemical equilibrium here. That means we have to consider the number and the charge of both, that the diffusion forces and the electrical forces at the very end come to an equilibrium as such. And all those holes and holes with a certain attitude, that means ion channels that are selective for type of ions, that are open at a certain voltage and close after a certain time, they have those different properties then. And they can build alliances. That means there are co-transport structures where one ion needs a second ion to be able to pass. And that could either be in symport, that means both go hand in hand in the same direction. So for example here a potassium and a chloride, they are then electroneutral and they go together through such a thing. Or an antiport, that means one ion is exchanged by another one going in and or out. If we need energy here as delta G for free enthalpy of molecules, then it's an active transport. And if we need energy to transport something, we quite often do that transport against a hurdle. That could be an energy barrier in an electrical field, or that could be against the gradient in diffusion. And therefore we need energy, and that energy comes from whatever energy source in the human body. It's quite often adenosine triphosphate, and then we split it up from ATP in adenosine diphosphate, ADP, and free phosphor, having then that delta G as free enthalpy to drive that ion against an electrical and or diffusion gradient. Good question. Just repeat it for the recording. If we have that co-transport, if it's single channel or multiple channels, I would say if it's really a co-transport, it's a single channel, and then we would need to look really into details how this looks like. Yeah. And to be honest, I give up if I see those simulations of molecule conformations. I'm deeply impressed about that, but that's not my field of expertise. So I keep my fingers off to give you good explanations about that, how it really works. You know, how the conformation must be that this ion is able to either be get entropic shielding to get through, or gets into a pocket and the pocket moves somewhere through that channel. That's cool stuff, but far beyond the things I like to share with you. So the ion distribution, as I said, we always have to check out where we are. This is here a muscle cell of a mammal. In a nerve cell, it looks a bit different. So, and if you remember last time, the muscles had those tubuli where calcium taps in to mediate between the incoming action potential and the muscle contraction. Therefore, we have calcium here in the extra and in the intracellular space, since this is a muscle cell. Then if we would go to a nerve cell, we would not take care of the calcium in there, and it would be easier. As you see, we have here these large anions in the intracellular space. Outside, it doesn't matter because we have so much space outside, they can diffuse wherever they like to go. And we have a resting potential here of minus 90 millivolt inside versus outside. In a nerve cell, we would be rather towards minus 70. If we go to a squid, a snail, a frog, whatever, this is slightly changing. Therefore, if you like to go into the details, always check it up. Where are we talking about? Which species is that? Which type of cell? But all in all, the distribution is quite similar. So we have sodium, potassium, chlorine, and large anions in the inside. We have the same outside. And we see that we have more sodium outside than inside, more potassium inside than outside, and more chlorine outside than inside in both nerve and muscle cells. And I don't take care of the rest for a moment. And that would mean if we just now say, well, if we have more sodium outside than inside, for example, it would be more positive outside than inside. So the electrical field will go from plus to minus here. And also the gradient is more outside than inside. So it's driving, if you would open a gate, the ions would go for both the electrical field and the diffusion from the outside to the inside. And the more they are on the inside, so the number is rising, the driving force in the gradient is getting less. And we have a kind of equilibrium all side with the charges. If we look on potassium, it would be the other side. And chlorine also, we just have to switch from a plus to minus in our mind. And as I think you already get the idea, it's not that this is completely independent. So if we have both of them, there might be certain mobility of certain ions. Some of them might be faster or slower, might have larger driving forces or smaller driving forces. And at the very end, we have to find a way to put them all together to come to our results that we want to get. Here with the resting potential, there are different models, how you can imagine that. And you always have to check, is this a description where the resting potential is already there? Yeah, where I say, hey, look, this is what we have, and this is, it is shown here. Or if this is a thought experiment where it say, imagine we start somewhere. And then there is a delivery of certain thought experimental steps that end up in that resting potential of minus 70 to minus 90 millivolt. And that's important to keep that in mind. It's of course not that we start with every cell from the scratch, but this is more to get the idea how processes superimpose to each other. And you see here then the different ion channels, for example. We have the concentration and the voltage gradient can go either in the same direction or in different directions. And what you find here in parentheses is the concentration. And next to that is the potential that would arise just by that single ion. So if you just would have that concentration of sodium, we would have a sodium potential here. E stands for the potential and Na for the sodium of plus 56 millivolts from the inside to the outside. If it would be just potassium, then it would be minus 102, chlorine would be minus 76, and calcium here would be plus 125. The fabulous sodium-potassium pump, which you probably all have heard about so far, is not there to drive all the processes, but is a kind of support to get the whole stuff back at equilibrium at the end. And it's just a small portion, if we go later on to the action potential, of ions that goes in and out. It's not that your nerve cell is completely empty after 3 action potentials and you have to wait for a day or something like this. It's really just a very small portion of ions that you cannot, at regular activity, exhaust a nerve cell. Even though we might feel exhausted after those 90 minutes here of thinking, it's not that your brain is empty and you have to wait for a day until all the ions are back in place. That's just a little bit of the amount of ions here. The underlying equation, one of the famous ones, I think you have to learn probably 5 equations in that course, and this is one of those. That's the Nernst equation, tells us that the potential that arises is calculated by the gas constant, the absolute temperature, something that's called the charge number, and the Faraday constant. The good thing is gas constant and Faraday constant, as the names already say, are constant. We are mammals, that means our body core temperature is about 37 degrees, plus 273 Kelvin is then up to you, 300 something Kelvin that we have. And a charge number means how many free charges do I have. So potassium, sodium is plus 1, chlorine is minus 1. And then we have to take the natural logarithm with the concentration outside over the concentration inside. And if you do that, you come to that numbers from the previous slide. At the very end, we don't want to have those numbers as such, but we want to have the description how the whole situation is described. And this comes over this slide to the over next one. And that thermodynamic equilibrium, as I tried to explain, that diffusion part and that charge part comes together and forms a dynamic equilibrium, where thermodynamic equilibrium means that particles can go back and forth, but over time average it comes to that situation. And equilibrium state means the exchange current over time, left to right, right to left, is 0. That's this here, that exchange current for a particular ion X. And since we have more ions, we will have different exchange currents that sum up then to 0. We have, again, gas constant temperature here. You see the Faraday constant and the charge number. We see a mobility. That is something some of you might know from semiconductor physics. So if we have particles or charges, depending how the environment is, they can move slower or faster. That is called the mobility here. And then we have a very complex equation that I like to cut down for you to get it more, that you get a grasp on that. We have here 2 parts. That is the first part. This is the equation that you might know from diffusion. the derivative of the concentration over space. And we simplify that here. We could include now a nabla and make it really fancy for people you like to impress, or we know that we just look into one direction, and that is the direction over the cell membrane, right? We want to see what does happen from intracellular to extracellular space, and we call that direction X. So it's the concentration C of a certain ion K over the direction X, right? And depending how willing our ion channels are to let that happen, we have that mobility here, the mu, for that particular ion, and then we have, for thermodynamic reason, the gas constant and the temperature. Since we stay at 37 degrees if we are not sick, so we can say this is a constant term. And then we have the second part here. And this is the derivative of the electrical potential over space. Yeah, that's the driving d phi over dx. That's the electrical field that drives charged particles over space. And to know how much they are driven, we have, this is independent of gas constant and temperature, therefore we have them in a denominator to get rid of them with those here before, but we have their concentration, we have the charge number, and the Faraday constant, who tells us how much charge do we have per mole. Yeah, and this is all, right? And that shows us that these are competing forces. So the electrical one and the, let's say, the chemical one, from the number of uncharged particles. And this comes together, and over time average, this is 0. That is what this Donen equilibrium tells us. And I think if you cook that down, it's much easier to understand, and it's a good description how both forces come together and drive that to an equilibrium, given that at this observation point, nothing happens with the channels. But we are at the resting potential, so we can say, well, we take a snapshot and nothing changes over that time of the snapshot. And then we can define the permeability of ions, so the opportunity of a particular ion to go through that membrane, as the mobility of an ion divided by the membrane thickness, and then multiplied with those constants that they have, the gas constant, the temperature, and the Faraday constant. And since we are in mammals, I take the temperature as constant. If we would be in snakes or squids or snails or whatever, we have to consider that, and this is a significant change then. So 10 degrees C, which is nothing from the shades to the sun, might result in nerve conduction velocity in those species with a factor of 2, for example. So that's really something. You all know that when you get cold hands and you try to do something where you need good motorics, good sensory feedback, and it's really freezing cold outside, that you fail with that. If the hands are warm again, then everything is back to normal. And this is the background, that the nerve conduction velocity, due to those equations and the influence of the temperature, might change some processes there. There's even an orphan disease. I know that because I got once a request what one could do. There's an orphan disease called Morbus Oldenburg. And this is a disease where people get paralyzed if their limbs get too cold. So it's a reversible paralysis. So you go out in the cold and you can no longer move your hands. Come back into the room and you can, after some minutes, move your hand again. And I got a request, what could I do? And I said, well, the easiest thing that comes to my mind is go to one of those shops for motorcycle drivers and ask for heated gloves. So then you have a battery in your glove, and you can heat your glove, and then your fingers stay at a decent temperature, and you don't get into that paralysis. So that's crazy stuff that's around in some diseases, and it can be then quite easily linked to all the basic processes that we have. And that's the reason why I want to share those stories with you, that you probably keep those mechanisms better in mind. If we bring that all together, what I've talked about, we come to the Goldman equation. And the Goldman equation gives us an idea how to get all those ions together to come to that resting membrane potential. We have the usual suspects here as constants. We have a natural logarithm. We have that conductivity of ions and the concentration. And if you look sharply here in the denominator, you don't see the charge number. The reason for that is that the charge number of sodium, potassium, and chlorine is 1. So if you multiply something with 1, it doesn't matter. But take care, if we take the sign into account, the sign of chlorine is -1. And if you go back to your high school days, or a math course at university, and the laws how to handle logarithms, you might remember if you have a -1 in a ratio, in a logarithm, you are allowed to exchange numerator and denominator. And this is what is done here with the chlorine. So we have extracellular concentration of potassium and sodium here in the numerator, and intracellular in the denominator. For chlorine, -1, we have it just the other way around. So intracellular on the numerator, extracellular on the denominator. Oops. And, well, this is chemistry. As an electrical engineer, I'm always a bit struggling with chemistry, and I'm much more in favor of electrical equivalent circuits. If you come from biology or chemistry, it's probably just the other way around. But you can exchange that. If you see something like that, you see, well, we have a kind of a potential, an electrical one, and due to the permeability or the mobility, that looks a little bit like the resistance. You know, how much force do I need to drive the current? And force, in this case, how much potential do I need to drive a certain current? That sounds a little bit like that relation with the resistance between current and voltage. And if you do that, you come to that equivalent circuit where the sodium-potassium pump is not in, because that's an active source. We like to have here the passive properties of a cell membrane in that description. And what do we have? We have the cell membrane, which we neglected so far, but we know that this is a phosphate bilayer. And if you have a layer there, you can model that layer as a capacitor. So two plates at a certain distance, and whatever happens in between is modeled in the capacitance or in the permittivity or something like that. That's here. And having a capacitance means we can have displacement currents over the capacitance if the potential changes outside. This is modeled here. Then we have sodium, potassium, and chlorine, the channel properties of conductivity as variable resistances. And we have the Nernst potential here as a battery. The long line is always the plus. That means we have here potassium in one direction, plus, minus, and sodium and potassium and chlorine here in the other direction, as you can see or compare some slides ago. And then the rest, where we say, there's something else that we need to match the model to reality, is here as leakage currents. All the rest of the ions, they might have an additional potential, they might have a certain conductivity. That's all summarized here. And if we take that and describe how much current might flow through, we have this capacitive current that we have to consider and the ionic currents here, the other ones. Capacitive current is the capacitance of the membrane times the derivative of the potential over time, so dV over dt. And then we have the rest here. It's the voltage divided over the resistance. And as we will see later on, this is a mean thing. The resistance is dependent on the voltage that we have over the membrane, and it depends on the time after which the voltage has changed. So it's a very dependent thing. It's not, and this is not Ohm's law. Ohm's law was always voltage over current is constant. So no matter what you apply, it's all the constant R that you get. This is not true for this setting here. R is still V over I, but it's no longer constant. Since our nerve is not a point source, but our nerve is distributed over space, we need to extend the model from a point source description into something with a real dimension. And this is done if you take some segments. It's sometimes called the cable model that we have, originally developed for telecommunication and the old lines over land. We had old-style telephone calls, and the question was, how much capacitance do they have, how much resistance, what about the length? And this is then chopped down into segments, and we have to assign certain parameters to the segments. So R, a C for the capacitance, a potential, and a conductivity over the length. And then we look at different spots of different segments, give them a distance, delta x, and a potential. And we number the nodes from minus infinity to plus infinity or smaller numbers, and calculate the potential difference in there. Already mentioned that last time. We have unmyelinated nerve fibers. There we really take the distance of the part of the nerve that we consider. If we take myelinated nerve fibers with nodes of Ranvier, delta x is in this case the distance between adjacent nodes of Ranvier. And if you go into modeling, then there are sometimes some more details one has to consider there to make your model best possible. What is important is to get an idea how you derive those equivalent circuit parameters from reality, or how they are linked. You don't have to go with a ruler to the nerve and measure things, but if you get an idea, it helps us later on to understand the laws and the processes that take place during electrical stimulation. And we have here the conductivity over the length. And if we take, for first approximation, the nerve as a cylinder over length, we would say, well, the conductivity of such a cylinder depends on the cross-sectional area. That's here P times D squared over 4. That's the cross-sectional area. Then it comes the length. That's delta x. And the material parameter, the conductivity of that nerve as such. That's here. And even though if there might be the same soup in each and every nerve cell, we see that this longitudinal conductivity depends on the diameter of the nerve. The larger the nerve diameter is, the better it conducts. If we keep in mind that R is 1 over G, that means the thicker a nerve is, the lower is its resistance. Yeah, you know that if you have once had your basic electrical engineering course, you know thicker conductors have a lower resistance than thinner conductors. Yeah, that's the same here for nerves. And then we have GM and CM. That's the M stands here for membrane. That means it's the surface of that dashed area here. We have again a cylinder, so the surface is 2 times pi times R or pi times D. Yeah, that's here. And then we have the length. Here, the length of a node of Ranvier, if we are in a non-myelinated nerve fiber, we can also take the same delta x as here, but if you look on the previous slide, there is that differentiation between myelinated and unmyelinated, and therefore you have to do it in your mind to exchange that L by the delta x if you switch from myelinated to unmyelinated. And then we have here GM, so the membrane conductivity. If you have the membrane resistance, you have to just do the inverse 1 over that. And here for the membrane capacitance, the same story, but with that specific capacitance of the membrane. That also shows us the larger the nerve diameter, the more surface we have. I mean, that's not surprising, but it's important to keep in mind, right? The larger a nerve is, the more surface we have. The more surface we have, the more space there is for ion channels. That's probably something how we can link things together. And as we will see later on, the larger the nerve diameter is, the easier it is to stimulate it electrically. And this is here the background with those geometrical assumptions that we have to take. Now, we have the nerve cell membrane, and the goal for today is to understand why does an action potential travel over an axon when it's generated. That means we have to look, how do electrical signals travel along something? And we have to look, what is an action potential? And then we have to bring both together. This is here, and this is in electrical stimulation. This is kind of important, therefore I'm going slowly through all of those slides. So if we have now a nerve, this goes here from the top of the slide to the bottom of the slide, and we have the extracellular space to the left-hand side and the intracellular space to the right-hand side. And we would inject a current here from the current source. That trains your German here a little bit. That's the current source. And we measure the potential. And we have a longitudinal resistance. Then we have a voltage drop over the resistance. And the amplitude would get smaller and smaller and smaller over space. And that would mean if we would have just a passive structure and we would inject current somewhere, the current would not go to the very end because the voltage at the very end would be 0 because there's so much resistance in between that all that stuff drops down. And that raises the question, what does the nerve do to keep the amplitude as high as possible? And what is a good mechanism? I mean, you could do that every micrometer, then it would take a lot of energy and would be probably quite slow. Or you do it in a way like clever repeater station in networks, where you say, I'm able to go there, and from that other point I have to amplify it again and go to the next relay station. And this is a bit now the storyline that goes through the next slides. First of all, I like to bother you again with that subthreshold. So the purely passive structure. Imagine we have now a nerve here lying around, we inject current somewhere, and we record the potential over space. Then we get here decrease in that potential due to the passive, resistive, and capacitive components. Resistance is the magnitude, and the capacitance that we have is that the step function is not rectangular, but by the RC, the filter stuff, we get a rounding of charging and decharging. That's the displacement current on the capacitive part of the membrane that we have. And if we then display the membrane potential over space, we get a kind of such an e to the minus x function. So we have an exponential decay over space. And this is then called the length constant, and the length constant describes at which distance the magnitude is 1 over e. That means 63% of the maximum value that we have. And you can calculate that and find out that this depends on the extracellular resistance, the intercellular resistance, and the membrane resistance. Again, that means changing the SUPS concentration, so intracellular concentration, extracellular concentration, and the dimension of that whole stuff determines how the magnitude of the length constant and the decay over space. This is just another slide showing the same content but in different colors. If you would have here that current step function, current on, current off, you would say, oh, this here we have a time, well, we have 63% rise time, decay time, here it's then 37%, that's the rest, the remaining from the 63 to 100%, and thereby we can describe the membrane property over space and over time. And we can calculate that at the dendrites and wherever we want to do that. If we go from that subthreshold to suprathreshold, that means we do a stimulation where we get an action potential. And we record here over an unmyelinated nerve. We will find out that this amplitude, so the magnitude of an action potential, stays the same over the nerve. That means that's cool. It really gets conducted from one end of the nerve to the other end of the nerve. But as we will find out if we summarize the nerve conduction velocities later on, we'll find out those unmyelinated nerve cells are quite slow. So we have 1 meter per second. That will mean from my little toe to my brain, it would take 1.5 or nearly 2 seconds. If you would imagine a dinosaur with that nerve conduction velocity, if somebody bites up his tail, it takes probably a minute or two before this species recognizes, oh, something's going on. If you would be mean, you could say that was the reason why they died out, but I don't think so. Right? So it's always good to get something of those things in mind. What does that mean? What does that mean? 1 meter per second, right? And therefore, we come after a few slides to myelinated nerve cells. But before we come there, we have now found out there is something like an action potential, and it travels over the nerve. And I want to dive a bit more in detail what happens there. And this is one of my favorite slides where we can put all the things we learned so far today together. So we know channels open specifically for ions, and I introduced that equation that the resistance of such a membrane is dependent on the voltage and over time. So there seems to be something that needs a threshold, and then it takes a certain time. And this is a kind of mousetrap behavior. You know, if you have a mousetrap, you need a certain force, and then something happens until it's closed. And we measure intracellular versus extracellular, the electrical potential. We start, and here is a Z instead of C. I stole that from a German textbook, so extracellular instead of extracellular. So imagine this should be a C for the English terminology. And we have here the sodium-potassium pump, and we have channels which open and close. So, and potassium comes in over channels that open here, and sodium goes out. And then, after a certain period of time, the arrows here are smaller, and the larger an arrow is, the more current flow or ionic flow occurred, and then it goes back to rest. So we have 3 sodium channel states. They're open, they're closed inactive, and they're closed active, and they need to be close active before they can get activated again. It's like opening your mousetrap again. And we have sodium in 2 channel states, open and closed. And this is only half of the truth. If you would now say, I want to become a molecular biologist or a channel expert, you will find out I'm lying here. That's not true. I don't know how many states we have in those channels. There might be probably currently 20 or something like that if you go in the latest Nature publications to find out what they really do. So a lot of subspecies, but for simplicity, let's assume that's halfway the truth. That is like the classical mechanics and quantum mechanics. You can tackle a lot of real-world problems with classical mechanics, ignoring the dualism of particles and waves or stuff like that. It's similar here. So the truth is much more complex, but I think it's good enough for us here to get the basic idea. We have the action potential starting from the resting potential, boom, boom, making such a peak, going back into hyperpolarization, and then ending up at the resting potential again. This happens because the channels open. And to my best of my knowledge, they open when the threshold is exceeded. So threshold in German is Schwelle. So the threshold is exceeded and sodium and potassium channels open. However, if you remember a Goldman equation, different conductivity, so they open in different dynamics. And here, this is G, the conductivity of sodium and potassium. They open at the same point in time, but the sodium is much faster. And we have a kind of stochastic behavior in the background, as in many processes that we have in nature. It's not really really, it's triggered, but then the channels open and close with a certain uncertainty relation, and this is the reason why we get that distribution. sodium channels close, and therefore the conductivity is decreased, and potassium open at the same point in time, but get its maximum a little bit after the maximum potential peak here, and then is really reducing that slowly. And by that dynamics, we get an undershoot here. And that undershoot is necessary to for transition of closed inactive to closed active of the sodium channels. And as I said last time, if you look up ion channels on Google, there is one particular page who has a different terminology and a completely different description of the action potential. I think it's wrong because I checked it up in many other textbooks. But take care. There's just one, and they also said in their footnote, this is all done by experts. So it looks serious, but the action potential looks different. They have different wording instead of depolarization and repolarization there. So please take care if you look for additional information that you don't get into that trap, or bring me a good textbook which describes that everything is completely wrong while I'm talking here, then I change it next year. There is one textbook, and this is a kind of chicken and egg thing. I'll describe here the electrical activity. There's a book, Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life. Really crazy one. And this popped up, I guess, 2 years ago, and when you record that with high-resolution microscopes, you see that the membranes move during ion influx or outflux. And you can imagine if something happens with charge and diffusion, that influences the membrane. And the question now is, if you describe the electrical phenomena and take the mechanical phenomena as side effect, or you say, well, that's not true. It's just the mechanical movement that induces then all the electricity behind. And that pops up every 15 years or something like that. People say, I have now a microscope that shows that mechanical actuation comes first. To be honest, from an engineering perspective, I don't mind what the truth is. It helps me to describe it from an electrical point of view to get the electrical stimulation sorted out. And therefore, I personally do not mind if one description is true or the other one, as long as it helps us to understand what's happening there. And therefore, I stick to my electrical description here. Just want to point out, I know the other one. If you have fun with that, it's probably nice to get an idea how people make their minds on that, but it's not necessary for that course as such. Here we have I have two challenges for you. One is that this is again stolen from a German textbook. The second challenge here is, and I have no idea why they did that, is that non-myelinated nerve fibers are left and myelinated are right in the upper sketch, and it's just the other way around in the lower sketch. And this is stolen from the same page of that textbook. Yeah. So I have no idea. It's probably they want to find out if you're still awake here. In the non-myelinated one, left-hand side, in the upper one, we have that restitution of an action potential in neighboring patches over the nerve length. So when I have an action potential here, I have displacement currents to the neighboring patch. If I have a displacement current, I can imagine that a little bit of that charge goes to the neighboring patch, increases the threshold because I have then more positive charge inside at that spot. That means I increase the potential, I cross the threshold, the action potential is triggered, boom, and then I have the same on the next spot. I have something like a refractory period. That means I cannot excite the nerve immediately after that, and that helps to drive the action potential in one direction, because the upper part, let's say, is refractory, and then it goes downwards. Action potential, the upper part is refractory, can only travel downwards. This goes to the right-hand side here. Showing that we have a lot of repetitions over space, over an axon, and that it takes for 2 millimeters a time of 2 milliseconds to come from one place to the other side. In myelinated cells, we have that Schwann cell around, a highly insulating fatty tissue cell, and we have sub-threshold conduction in between the nodes of Ranvier. This is what we have seen with the decay constant. So we have a potential that gets smaller, 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 but is still large enough to be super threshold at the neighboring node of Ranvier, eliciting the next action potential. But that means all that charge transfer over the membrane is in 2 millimeters probably done only once. In between we have that passive decay, and there it's done only once, and that shows here that we have 0.2 milliseconds instead of 2 milliseconds, so factor of 10, with saltatoric excitation, where an action potential kind of jumps from one node of Ranvier to the other. In reality, it goes even over 2 orders of magnitude. So the fastest fibers we have in the body are up to 120 meters per second, instead of 1 meter per second in the non-myelinated fibers here. And this is shown here with an English description, then with the ion channels showing in unmyelinated nerve conduction velocity. We have the sodium influx, the potassium outflux, then the refractory period, and go slowly from one patch to the other. In the myelinated one, we have here a much nicer Schwann cell wrapped around the axon. We have no ion channels over the insulated part, and please do not ask me why. There could be the option to have some, but they would not make sense there, and that is probably the reason why over evolution they vanished there. We have the activation only on the nodes of Ranvier, that means in between the Schwann cells. And as we'll see later on, this is a beautiful mechanism where the distance between the nodes of Ranvier is perfectly matched to the thickness of the nerve fiber, and thereby to the attenuation that we have. That means a thicker nerve fiber having a smaller longitudinal resistance would have a smaller voltage drop per unit length. And therefore it could travel longer to get to the threshold. That will mean you could have less nodes of Ranvier over a certain distance if you have a thicker fiber. And that causes then the faster nerve conduction velocity, since you need to replicate the action potential less often over a certain distance. So that all goes back to fundamental electrical conductivity equations at the very end. That's very fascinating to me, that you can take those very simplistic explanations to see that this is valid in such a complex structure. And yeah, that's the same in different pictures again, to see that the myelinated nerve fibers are much faster. This whole description, action potential, influx of sodium, outflux of potassium, how does length constants and whatever come into the play, has been described by Hodgkin and Huxley. They've made a simulation model, and I think they got the Nobel Prize for Physiology in 1957. So in between 1952 and 1957 something. Always forget that. And this is a set of coupled differential equations where the conductivity of the channels comes into play, the equilibrium potential due to the concentration, and the current voltage that we have. And these currents go into that equation that needs to get integrated then over time. And this was a nice set of experiments. They did not only set up those equations in the 1950s, where analog computers were still at stage, and digital computers were with paper cards to load the operation system and relays or tubes. So that was not something where you could do simulations forever and say, oh, this is the truth. So they did experimental settings on giant squid axons, and then made their mathematical model and then simulated a little bit to find out the right parameters, and that brought them to the Nobel Prize. Later on, that was transferred from the squid to mammals, and some extensions have been made. Frankenhäuser-Huxley is one of the next models then being extended to mammals. I can tell you the equations got even more complex, and there are a lot of boundary condition approximations that have to go in there. Luckily, there are some simulation packages around where you don't have to program everything in whatever Python, C++, C#, or something like that. But there are models around simulation packages where you could do that on certain levels. And this is the important part. Not every simulation package meets your requirements. If you want to see how the action potential changes due to certain molecular changes, probably one, the neuron package fits. There are others which are then more shaped to stimulation or to recording, that you get something, and there are some places around the world where you can download that. It's all made from neuroscientists or engineers, for neuroscientists and engineers, so it's really pain in the neck to use most of those packages. Some of them have a decent graphical user interface. Some of them still prefer line-oriented inputs. So it's nothing you do just on a Sunday afternoon. It really takes its time to go into that. But it's important to know there are approved, validated models that one could use to get something out of that. Some of them are for free. That means if you just want to play around a little bit and to see, well, what is that with the resting potential and how does that influence something? I think if you type in nerve simulation model, you get to some of the pages where you get simple models for free. So, if we are in contact with persons from clinical medicine, their main job is to do proper diagnosis and suggest good treatment strategies. That means in daily life, they're probably not that much interested in solving differential equations. Therefore, it's good to know that there are certain classifications rules in clinical practice to which one could rely. So, and we have here two classification schemes. One is from Erlanger and Gasser. This is for sensory nerve fibers. And Hoyt and Lloyd and Hunt did the same for motor nerve fibers. And therefore, since the outcome is comparable, they are quite often squeezed in one table here. So we have the ABC classification from fast to slow, and then we have a subdivision of A with Greek letters alpha, beta, gamma, delta. In the motor fibers, or is it the other way around? No, I think Lloyd Hunt is motor. That doesn't match that much, which is written next to that. Is 1, 2, 3, 4 in Roman numbers. So we have that. If we look on the classification, what belongs to what, that's what I come at the end here. We have an assignment to mean fiber diameters of the axons, and then an associated nerve conduction velocity here with a mean and then a range behind that. So we come from about, let's say, 100 meters per second at the fastest down to 1 meter per second at the slowest. And the fiber diameter thickness goes from 13 to 15 microns diameter down to 1 micron in unmyelinated ones. And if we look what modality that we have is assigned to which fiber type or which speed, we find out that this seems to make a sense. So primary muscle spindle afferents and efferents and efferents are very fast conductive. The muscle spindles are the strain gauges, let's say, in the muscles. That means if we need to have fast reaction to muscles because of stretch or something, this should go fast within milliseconds. For example, if I stand here and have to keep balance and something disturbs me, it should go fast, otherwise I would lay on the floor before some control reaction could have happened. And that's the same for tendon organs. Tendon organs are the strain gauges at the end of the muscle. So in the tendons, to see what tension do I have between muscle and the fixation on the bones. So it's both the tension and the length there with the muscle spindle afferents that I have to control this system. Mechanoreceptors on the skin and skin afferences on touch and pressure are slower conducting. That means I touch something, that's fine, that goes in the middle range here between 20 and 50, something like that, that can take a little bit longer. Temperature and nociception and deep sensitivity of the muscle are even slower, and this is split up that pain goes faster than temperature. So there's a general temperature perception that goes relatively fast, and then it takes longer to differentiate between cold and heat. For me that makes sense, because if I touch something that is either too cold or too hot, the first thing I should do is keep my fingers off. And if I have my fingers off, I can decide, did I have burns or did I got frozen? I don't know. I think I haven't told you that story. Don't know if you know that if this children game is still around. When I was young, we had those attitudes to tell stories and make kind of like theater plays amongst peer groups or something like that. And quite often was that you got blinded with a scarf, and then there were bit scary tales that somebody told. One of the favorite, you could only do that once in a group, then was all done. Was a fairy tale about you get caught by old knights and they want to punish you, and there is a glowing sword, and that glowing sword will now be put into your neck. And then you took an ice cube and dropped that ice cube into the back of that person. And you feel the heat first. Yeah, that is because that fast pain does not differentiate between heat and cold. And then you say, oh, it was just an ice cube. But first you got that shock that something happened that you don't want to experience. And if the story is good enough, you don't know then, and especially if you do that sitting around a campfire or something like that, you don't know, is there a crazy person around who does something with a campfire or not? You know, of course, this is politically completely incorrect, but it was a lot of fun. And I think this is a good example why it does make sense to have those different velocities here, that you get safe first, and then you get the more detailed information where you can decide what to do. And this is on many levels there. It's the same with touch and perception. So you have that touch. I'm touching that table, but I have no idea what the texture of the table is. And if you move your fingers slowly or faster over a surface, then you get speed and acceleration in there. And we have all three of those: indentation, speed, and acceleration as skin sensors. And the spatiotemporal integration then gives a good idea: what do I feel, what do I need? And you cannot try that out. But that grasping, for example, is one of those examples where you can take your visual feedback, so that's one of the control loops, but you can also hold a fragile glass while closing your eyes without letting it fall. And I did some experiments in my early career because I was very excited about a paper I read that holding a glass is not depending on the force with which you hold it, but you control that while identifying microslips. And you might have experienced that if you have a rough glass, you might hold it with a lower force than a very smooth or slippery one. If you have grease in your fingers, then you hold it much stronger because you're a bit afraid of letting it fall. And this whole control loop of grasp force is done by microslips. So it's not on the pressure force, but there are sensors that measure the tangential force. And if you have a slip, you increase your force again, and then you slowly release it until you get a next microslip to maintain it at the lowest possible force. And that is the reason, amongst others, why you are not as good when holding things without sensory feedback if you just have your visual control. For example, after loss of a limb, if you get an artificial prosthesis, you can watch what you do, but in those cases where you don't know the stiffness of the object, or you would need a very graded grasp force, then you have disadvantages just with your visual control over that. When we talk about nerve conduction, nerve integrity, I should not close that lecture without talking about nerve damage. And this is an old style classification according to Seddon and Sunderland, which is still in place. Sunderland just counted the grades, the severity of grades 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Seddon might have had Greek at school or in education, so he looked up all the Greek names for that: neuropraxia, axonotmesis, and neurotmesis there. And this gives an indication how severe that is. If you have just a pressure, a conduction block, because to local compression, might happen if you have the wrong hiking shoes on your feet, for example, and then you get a numb toe or something like that, that passes away after some weeks or months. It's just compression. If the compression gets more serious and You might have disruption of the nerve fibers, but they're still in their Schwann cell sheaths. This is then axonotmesis. That can be also very serious compression. So accidents where you kind of have traumatic impact on your nerves or on your spinal cord, sports accidents, for example. Then there is a possibility of complete recovery. If you lost the axonal continuity, but the perineurium, that means the cell structure around those nerve fiber bundles, is still intact, you have an irreversible damage, and some neurological deficits may remain, but you know they are more confined in regeneration, the nerve cells. If the perineurium is ruptured, that means it's more, everything is loose in space, it looks more like a salt and pepper pattern, then you have irreversible damage and neurological deficits remain for sure. And that's the same if the complete nerve is damaged. So, for example, chopping up a finger or a hand, then there might be a re-innervation, but if you look in details, discrimination distance, that means the distance where you can discover that there are 2 points instead of 1 point, this has probably changed. This is something you can do pairwise, for example, if you want to try that out. One should close the hands, and if you have 2 needles, for example, don't need sharp needles, could be blunt needles. You can try out that discrimination threshold on your arm, on your back, and on your fingers, and you will find out that finger threshold is about 1 or 2 millimeters. They say, oh, these are 2. If you go on your back, your discrimination threshold will be in the range of about 5 centimeters or even more. Underneath, smaller than 5 centimeters, you would still say, oh, this is 1 point. If you're slow enough, 1 knitting needle, the second knitting needle probably would add the 2 pokes is 2. But if you do it at the same point of time, you discover that's just 1 point due to that discrimination limit. Important to know when the next person stands up and say, I make a retinal prosthesis in a way that I stimulate your back. I can transfer the whole scenery of pictures here on your back. And you can calculate 7 centimeters or 5 centimeters and your back, even if you have a strong back. It's not that many points are there to discriminate a picture there. And we should not forget about those limitations there. That's important to keep in mind with that nerve damage if we talk about rehabilitation scenarios after certain damages, after certain traumatic injuries. Then we have to understand what kind of damage there has been, what is the current status of that nerve, to derive then adequate therapeutical interventions to restore something. If we ignore that, we might come up with a beautiful engineering system that does not work because the physiology or the pathophysiology is completely different in that point. And with that, as said last time, I like to summarize. Here are the learning targets. That means that helps you then to let you know what you should learn, what you should know, what you should look up, and what you should be able to discuss when it comes to an exam. So that's all for today. I'll try to save that lecture. I say I try to do that. I'm still not very familiar with the details of that program that have changed since the last update. At least the size of the files increased by a factor of 20. So we are still working on that to cook that down to size which is good for you to download that. Thank you very much for your attention, and hope we see next week again for the next part of that story. Thank you very much.